All right, ladies and gentlemen, since my UBS isn't wigging out on me anymore, I'm going to make a quick video here. Well, you know me, I don't do quick videos. For me, a quick video is if it's under an hour. This is a video I've wanted to make the entire time I was leveling in Season of Discovery Phase 4. I've been thinking about, well, you know me, I've been thinking about PvP a lot from a game design perspective, and I'm trying to find some methodology, some rule set that you can follow to be pretty. How do I put this? So that you don't have to relearn lessons of the past and make mistakes of the past. I don't know how to explain this, but in philosophy. When you're trying to understand something or you're trying to accomplish anything, right? Trying to be good at anything from a philosophical perspective. Your first order of business is to figure out how do thing good and avoid do thing bad. And then once you figure out how to do thing good and avoid do thing bad, the next course of action is for you to attempt to methodize it, meaning that you establish a set of rules that you can hand over to just about anybody else who hasn't had to go through all the trials and tribulations of learning it themselves, and they can just follow the rules for their own game or their own project, and subsequently they will be successful because they don't have to relearn all the lessons, and you get the idea. Scientific method is a methodization, believe it or not. So historically, what happened was Socrates, for example, spent his entire life trying to figure out how think good and avoid think bad, and he came up with a number of rules to assist him in doing that, called the philosophical method. And then, literally within a generation, Aristotle comes along and he methodizes those rules, and he gives us the scientific method. Same concept basically applies. Basically, the scientific method is a methodization of the philosophical method, which are a number of rules that you follow to, think good and avoid think bad. Achieve think good, avoid think bad. All right, so let's get started. Now, I already, in my assessment, methodized like how to make a good MMORPG. We already went down that road, and the methodization for how to make a good MMORPG ended up being first identify something that people would want in the game, then identify from a player-based perspective and a percentage of the player-based perspective who's going to be happy about the change, who's going to be unhappy about the change. If it's a net positive gain, then you can implement the change. If it's a net negative gain, then don't implement the change. And then I think the fourth and final rule was try to find a way to implement thing that will make said group happy in such a manner that it will make nobody else happy. Like, that's the holy grail of game design, basically, right there. Give the people what they want without pissing off anybody else. It's the exact same rule set of methodization for a political system, by the way. All right, so however, I've been trying to think about how to do this for years for PvP, because PvP is significantly more complex. So we're just going to sit here and have a conversation about it for a hot second. I think I want to keep it like right here just in case I need to start writing some stuff down here. But what I've established basically is that you have 4 options for your game, PvP-wise. None of these are mutually exclusive. However, there is an element of mutual exclusivity here. I don't know what the terminology is specifically for what I'm about to describe, so I'll just describe it. So essentially, you can have burst meta, you can have chip burst meta, you can have DPS CD meta, and then you can have a DPS meta. I'll describe these in turn really fast. But first, I would like to note that if you decide that you want your game to be a chip burst meta, this means that you cannot have burst meta. But within a chip burst meta, you can have DPS CD meta and you can have DPS meta, if that makes any sense. If you decide that you want your game to have burst meta, if you want it to exist within your game, like so that would be like some classes are going to operate as a burst meta class, then you can have all 4 of these at the same time. So they can all 4 exist in your game at the same time. It's probably better to think of things, and I might want to write this in the meta rules, but it's probably better to think of these things as on a class-by-class basis as opposed to an all-in kind of deal. So, for example, Classic World of Warcraft is very firmly set in a burst meta, which means that all 4 of these metas can manifest themselves on different classes, or even in the same fight, right? Like a fight might start out as a burst meta fight, but then if both parties are alive for an extended period of time, it might settle down into like a DPS or even a DPS CD meta, because they're just so low on mana or so low on resources or so low on CDs that they can't engage in a burst meta again, if that makes any sense. Then in TBC, we saw Blizzard actively, because they wanted Arena to be a thing, so they actively basically killed burst meta out of the equation. They basically slew burst meta from TBC, and they went all in on a chip burst meta, and that has some advantages, but just know that they're semi-mutually exclusive, or they have a kind of mutually exclusive relationship. But at the same time, if we're talking about multiple classes in a game, not really, right? Like this class can operate as a burst meta class. This class can operate as chip burst meta class. This class can operate as a DPS meta class, blah, 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 blah. So, for example, a good chip burst meta class example in Season of Discovery right now would be a Shadow Priest. I just got done dueling Shadow Priests. They dot you up with a bunch of spells, and then they try to Kamehameha you out of existence with like Mind Blast, Shadow Word Death combo, right? So it is what it is. All right, so let's talk about some more interesting things about the burst meta. So, to be perfectly honest, 3 out of 4 of these metas are actually pretty self-explanatory and pretty easy. It's really hard to screw them up. So it's actually really hard to screw up a burst chip meta. They don't have a lot of rules going on in there. They're pretty easy. It's pretty hard. The only thing you really need to pay attention to in a chip burst meta PvP context is HPS versus DPS, because that's going to dictate whether a class can even because how a chip burst meta is you're holding back a bunch of your damaging CD spells, and you're trying to wear the enemy down, their health bar down by like 20 or 30% before you Kamehameha them, right? So, but if your DPS while you're holding back on your DPS is not sufficient to chunk to overcome their HPS, to chunk their health bar down enough, you're never actually going to be able to burst on them in a burst meta context, right? But other than that, it's really easy to gear for, if that makes sense. The CD burst meta is very easy. We've seen many a CD burst meta in PvP arenas in the past. But the downside to the CD burst meta is it turns every fucking class in the game into a goddamn paladin. Every class in the game has a bubble or a get-out-of-jail-free card or a deterrence or something stupid like that, or a cocoon where they basically just become immune to all damage for an extended period of time. Literally every fucking class in the game has a bubble. If I sound pissed off about this, it's because I've lived through time periods in Classic World of Warcraft where every fucking class in the game had a goddamn bubble, except for my fucking paladin, which didn't have a bubble. Why is this? Well, because priests could dispel our goddamn bubble, warriors could shatter my fucking bubble. You get the goddamn idea. Really fucking annoying. It's like, oh, everyone else gets a bubble except for the OG class that actually needs bubble and is designed to need to use a bubble. Fucking awesome. So I'm still pissed off about that to this day. The DPS meta is a little fascinating but we've seen this before, right? So the main difference between a DPS CD meta and a DPS meta is whether or not you're waiting on enemies using defensive cooldowns or offensive cooldowns versus whether it doesn't really matter or not. So, for example, in the past, especially in Cataclysm, I remember this very clearly, Cataclysm dueling in arenas as a paladin, you were entirely dependent upon your wings. If your wings was up, you could DPS. If your wings was down, you did not have enough DPS to actually kill people. If your wings was down, you were in a pure DPS meta, and you were literally just sitting on top of the enemy praying to the RNG gods that you get like 10 critical hits in a row and that they die. Like your DPS effectively doubles for an extended period of time, and you're able to kill the enemy. Otherwise, you're waiting on your wings, which is more of the CD meta. But even then, you were often waiting on wings N for you to get a good RNG lay on your crits in order to kill enemy targets, which is closer to a DPS meta than it is to an actual CD meta. But there's not really much going on all that complicated in the chip burst meta or the DPS CD meta or the DPS meta, which is why you see a lot of games end up kind of gravitating towards it, because a semi-retarded monkey could balance those three types of metas. But the burst meta has some interesting stuff that we actually need to talk about in conjunction with it. So I'm trying to write some rules here for the purposes of methodization, but it's still a little fresh in my brain. So if it doesn't cover everything, you've been warned. Or if you have some information yourself, spit it out and it'll be factored in. All right, so the first rule that I've identified with the burst meta is that you need multiple bursts in order to kill a target. This is very important for a number of reasons. The first reason is that the burst meta is an awesome game meta because it's the only meta that I know of where chess games can really start to form in totality. The chip burst meta can have some chess game behind it, but it's a bit of a weak chess game, and it plays out more like checkers than actual chess. But in order to form the chess game that people like, now keep in mind when people say things like skill expression or what's the other, they use these weird terminologies, but they're really just expressing the exact same thing, and that is that they would like the fights to go on longer so that they actually have, they would like a my turn effect, if that makes any sense. It's like, okay, this burst class bursted on me, and if they just kill me, I never got to take a turn, therefore I never got skill expression, therefore I never got a chance to do anything. You just literally didn't get to counter in any way, shape, or form. So it wouldn't matter if there was like an ocean of items and trinkets and gadgets and gizmos in the game to really have a nice, deep PvP chess game evolve. You just died, like in like a silence or a stun or something like that. Congratulations, your burst meta sucks. So the first thing you need, and not even the bursters are happy about it, believe it or not. So the first thing you need is that you should require in your game multiple burst attempts in order to mathematically kill a target, okay? Otherwise, nobody is having fun. The burster's not having fun, and the person receiving the burst otherwise also isn't really having fun. So, for example, like a Palm Pyro Mage, right? A Palm Pyro Mage has an extremely, let's say a Palm Pyro Mage had like a 50% chance to kill a target in Classic World of Warcraft, but after he Palm Pyros a target, he's got no more bursts. Right? CD-wise, mechanically-wise, he has no more bursts. He shot his one and only a chance. If he had like an 80% chance to kill people, that would be bad game design because people would want to quit. We know from a psychological perspective that people aren't happy in a game unless they have at least a 30% chance to win. So if anybody is a burst class and they have an 80% chance to kill somebody in a Kamehameha, you've done fucked up as a game designer, because it means that people have like less than a 20% chance to win, which is absolutely terrible. But you want multiple burst attempts to be possible by a burst class, and you want multiple burst attempts to be needed by that burst class in order to effectively kill somebody. This will make fights take longer, which allows counterplay, it allows skill expression, it allows chess games to start to form, and it basically allows for a much more interesting and dynamic back and forth between the bursting class and whatever the recipient of the bursting class is. So in your game design for a bursting meta, you want to make it so that your bursting classes can burst over and over again, but they also, each burst has a relatively low % chance to just end the fight outright, right? That way it's a multiple, they mathematically require multiple bursting. All right, so that brings us to rule number 2 here. Let's just zoom in here really fast. I'm tired of looking at this as if it's not big. That brings us to rule number 2. Control Z. Right, so that brings us to rule number 2, which is the win rate per burst should be somewhere between 20 to 30%, depending upon how often they can burst, right? How often they can do a burst. This should include like mana bar concerns. So, for example, a Boomkin has a deep enough of a mana bar that they can kind of do somewhere around 3 to 4 bursts before they're completely Hunters are in the same category. They can do a very specific number of bursts before they run out of mana, and then they just cannot burst anymore. With those classes that can burst relatively often, but they have a cap on the number of bursts, each of their bursts should have a relatively high win rate. But the totality of the win rate should not really exceed 70% or maybe 80%, if that makes any sense. So for example, with a hunter, let's say every time a hunter bursts on someone, they have a 30% chance to kill them. Just everything comes up crits, and the target basically explodes from a mathematical perspective, right? But they can only get out like 4 bursts at a time. This is reasonable in a classic WoW environment with a bunch of, like, you know, whipperroot tubers and healing potions and all that kind of stuff. I am of the opinion that, and I might want to write this down. This might be something now that I'm thinking about it. I am of the opinion that if the burst is taking place while the enemy can take no action, if that makes sense. So if the bursting class has their opponent stunned or silenced or CC'd in such a way that they can't take any action, then the burst percentage win chance should be low. But if the class is designed so that while it's bursting, the enemy can take a bunch of actions. So elemental shaman, for example, while an elemental shaman is bursting on you, you can usually take a fair few actions. The best burst they can possibly do is to grenade stun you for 3 seconds, and then cast a 2-second lava burst into you, and then cast a 1.5-second chain lightning into you. The enemy is going to have 0.5 seconds of time to do something, or at least 0.3 seconds of time to do something while that grenade is in the air. They're casting lava burst. But at least they can take an action before they die. And if that action is, oh shit, let me, like, you know, use a healing potion or a whipperroot tuber before I explode here, then that's a completely different story than if they can take no action whatsoever. So if the enemy can take no action whatsoever before the burst is completed, then the burst should have a low win rate chance, or from a mathematical perspective, right? It should have a low success chance because there is no counterplay while the target is effectively CC'd, right? However, if the target can do things before they get blown up out of existence, that they can push buttons to possibly survive the burst, then suddenly it's okay for the burst to have a significantly higher win chance per burst. But generally speaking, as a general rule, we want bursting classes to need multiple bursts to kill the target, and because of this, we want each burst to have a relatively low win rate per burst. I really should write a 2A in here and talk about how if the burst is happening if the enemy can take no action within the confines of the burst should have a lower percent chance to end the fight. If the enemy can take actions while the burst is happening, then the burst is allowed to have a higher percent chance to end the fight, if that makes any sense. All right, number 3. Number 3 is a long one that I've thought about quite a bit, which I find really fascinating from a gearing perspective. Critical strike chance or other similar mechanics like, you know, double strike or extra attack or blah, 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 are literally what is dictating in a video game how often a burst will top end. And if a burst is top ending, it should be lethal, right? Or should have the potential of being lethal. It'll dictate how often this is happening in each of our multiple bursts that we're putting into the target. But it will not dictate whether the burst is lethal at the top end or not, if that makes any sense. So, for example, if I have a class and I increase its critical strike chance by 10%, that class might have had a 20% chance per burst to get enough critical strikes at the enemy that the burst becomes lethal, right? So it would need a 1 in 5 burst to actually top end enough damage, do enough crits to do enough damage to actually be potentially lethal to the enemy. But if I increase its critical strike chance by 10%, suddenly it would only need like a 1 in 4 or possibly even a 1 in 3 RNG lay on the crit to do enough crit damage to top end to kill the target. If, however, instead of increasing critical strike chance by 10%, I increased their damage by 10%, suddenly what you would see happen mathematically is it wouldn't need all of its attacks to crit anymore. So it might have needed like 3 out of 4 spell casts to crit in order to do enough top end damage to kill the enemy, which would be its 20% chance. But if I increase damage by 10%, suddenly it only needs 2 out of 4 of its spell cast to crit to end the fight. So suddenly it has the same effect of making it like a 1 in 3 or maybe even a 1 in 2 chance to that a bursting RNG lay is lethal. And you need to be very sensitive about this. But mathematically speaking, and here's where the 3A and the 3B come in, you as a game designer have a metric shit ton of wiggle room with your burst, with your critical strike chance to, what am I trying to say here? Before things start getting out of hand mathematically, before the burst meta starts going off the rails, if that makes any sense. So for example, without critical strike chance, you can't really have a burst meta. It doesn't exist, which is why the 3A starts at the 10% mark. So burst meta starts becoming a thing in a game when your classes have a 10% chance to crit. But from there, you can increase the critical strike chance all the way up to like 35% without actually breaking the meta whatsoever. So a 10% critical strike chance with 4 spell casts being required is something like a 1 in 9 RNG lay. By the time you're up to like a 35% crit chance, you're looking at like a 1 in 4 or a 1 in 3 burst, which if you look at the win rates, right, our 10% to 30% chance per burst is still perfectly reasonable, and we haven't broken the burst meta yet, right? In other words, if we're casting at a 30% critical strike chance, I'm trying to explain that there's a relationship between these two. There's a relationship between needing multiple bursts, keeping the burst win rate low, and what our critical strike chance is. Because critical strike chance is going to dictate how often each of our burst attempts are lethal, right? Is it a 1 in 4 lethality? Is it a 1 in 2 lethality? Is it a 1 in 3 lethality? A 35% critical strike chance in a game where you need 3 crits out of 4 crits in order to do enough of a burst to be lethal, right? What am I trying to say here? Is like a 1 in 4 or like a 1 in 3 RNG lay, which means that we are still within the bounds of our win rate being like, a 1 in 3 and a 1 in 4. That is between 10% and a 30% win rate. So everything checks out, right? Let me give you some examples, because I actually like where Season of Discovery PvP is at right now. It's most of the things in Season of Discovery Phase 4 are actually within line with a good burst meta game design. Hunter. Hunter is going to Chimera Shot you, Trap Launcher you, Chimera Shot you, and they need all 3 of those to crit. And when all 3 of those crit, they can do upwards of like 6,000 damage to a player, which is semi-lethal, semi-survivable. It really depends on how much fire resist their target has. But for example, I'm running around with 4,400 hit points. If they tried to burst on me like that, I've got like 6,000-ish hit points. It wouldn't take a lot of extra damage, like a grenade being thrown or their pet to stun me, and they get like some extra shots. That is potentially lethal damage if I do not have enough fire resist versus the explosive trap specifically, right? Which is good game design in my personal opinion. But they need they're doing 3 attacks and they need all 3 to crit. They could do a better burst if they turn you into an ice cube and they do like an aim shot and then they do a chimera shot and then they ice and then their best possible kill combo, which not a lot of them do because not a lot of them need to do right now, is to turn you into a damn ice cube and then to aim shot you, hope the aim shot crits, then chimera shot, then explosive trap, then chimera shot, right? That's their 4-hit combo burst. And if all of that crits, it's pretty much lethal to just about any class in the game, except they don't like doing that because there's counterplay involved there. The Chimera Shot, Explosive Trap Chimera Shot combo, that combo hits the target so quickly that they're dead before they can take an action. They're kind of dead before they even know what they're doing. But technically, they could hit a heal potion kind of a deal, or hit a Whipperroot Tuber and survive it no problem. There's counterplay under those circumstances, or just have enough fire resist. I'm going a bit too much into the weeds. The longer burst that has a 100% chance of being lethal, if in a good RNG lay, gives the enemy a hell of a lot of time to see that a good RNG lay is coming and to push defensive cooldowns and survive it. This is all good game design. Okay, do not get me wrong. This is all good game design. So what I'm trying to explain here is that needing a three crits out of 3 attacks as an RNG lay is fine for a class like a hunter because they have extremely high critical strike chance. That's perfectly fine. Needing a 3 out of 4 crit is also fine. Everything about the hunter is perfectly fine. It's the exact same thing with a boomkin. The boomkin RNG lay is I starfall you. I think I call it starfall, but it's not. It's the 6-second cooldown one that increases their star surge damage by like 80%. They need that thing to come down and stun you for 3 seconds, and then they do a star surge on you, and they need the star surge to crit. If the star surge crits you, it's going to do like 3,800 arcane damage. With the falling star thing hitting you as well, that thing's going to do like an extra 600 damage. You can see that he still needs a little extra oomph to do enough damage to force out some defensive cooldowns. But if you notice, the enemy gets to react, right? Because they've been stunned for 3 seconds on a 1.5 second GCD. This is just enough time for the boomkin to star surge on you. He can star surge on you and then do a moonfire, and the totality of that burst is somewhere around 6,000 damage if everything crits. So it is a 3 crit combo while the enemy can't really take an action. But if you play it, the enemy can take an action, so they can be spamming their healing potion and survive it. There's a chance that it doesn't crit, so they have to do the burst multiple times. They spend a lot of time dicking around, waiting the 6-second cooldown for the starfall or whatever to actually stun their target, because if it doesn't stun their target, it's really hard to pull off the combo. It's just good game design, right? Very, very good game design. Shamans are on the exact same boat. They have a really scary crit. My bad. They have a really scary burst, but there's RNG involved in the burst. So they have to burst in the target multiple times. Even if they do it off of a grenade stun like we talked about, there's some time for the enemy to take actions. Their burst win rate per crit, in all 3 of these cases that I've described in Season of Discovery, they're within, they need to do everything right? They need to multiple burst their target mathematically. Each of their bursts is between a 10 to 30% chance to do lethal damage to the target, so they have to do it multiple times. There's some counterplay involved, which is really, really nice, meaning it's going to take even more bursts, right? Like, oh, I got a good RNG lay, but all I did was force out his healing potion. That's good game design. That's when the chess game starts to form. And all of this is because their critical strike chance has not gone above 35%. Once your critical strike chance starts going above 35%, then suddenly your game is going to start breaking down, because that's going to take the burst win rate into and around 40-50% category, which per burst, which is where the burst meta starts breaking down. You can do the math on it if you want. But by the time you're around about a 50% burst, like let's just think about this for a second, right? If you have if you have a 50% chance to crit and you need 3 out of 4 spells to crit when you're doing a burst, you only need 1 and 2 bursts, right? Like 1 out of 2 bursts is going to do above a 50% average. So you're going to get those 3 crits, and you may or may not have broken the game. It becomes extremely likely that you'll get 4 crits in a row. I think 4 crits in a row is like a 1 in 4 RNG lay at a 50% critical strike chance. I could be wrong about that, but it's definitely happening at a 1 in 5 burst. So you've got something stupid like a 25% chance that you do unsurvivable damage, whether the enemy hits their Whipperroot Tuber or not. And that's happening every fucking time you're bursting on them in a burst meta where you're requiring the bursting classes to do multiple bursts. So your game starts breaking down. The burst meta starts breaking down when it goes above a 40% crit, and it's truly broken when it's at like a 50% critical strike chance or higher. Let's go to number 4. Increased critical strike chance changes the math on burst classes very little for a long time. Yeah, so this is your advantage as a game designer, is that there's a huge window of opportunity for you to give classes critical strike chance and critical strike chance like effects and abilities without actually breaking your burst meta game. Because the burst meta is between 10% crit chance and 35% crit chance mathematically, right? But once you start going above 35% crit chance, that's when you're kind of, you need to be aware mentally that you're entering a different kind of burst meta. You're entering different burst meta territory, and suddenly you need to increase the HP levels of many a class to bring it back in line so that basically above the 50% critical strike chance mark, and I would suggest that it's around above the 40% critical strike chance mark, and I should do another, this should be number 4 now that I'm thinking about it. Again, trying to methodize this stuff here. I'll try rewriting this at the end of the video so it's a more appropriate methodization. What am I trying to describe here? Before the 40% critical strike chance mark, needing 3 out of 4 crits in a burst is a good meta. Above the 40% critical strike chance mark, that meta begins to break down, and suddenly you need your targets to have enough HP that 3 out of 4 crits in an RNG lay don't kill anymore. And suddenly we need the RNG lay to be 4 out of 4 crits is what will kill the target, if that makes any sense. Because otherwise they're running around with like a 1 in 2 chance to kill the enemy unless they use major CDs. And then there's a 1 in 4 chance that they kill them whether they used major CDs or not, because all 4 things crit, right? But if we bring the HP levels up a notch so that suddenly 3 out of 4 crits do not kill the target anymore, and they require 4 out of 4 crits to kill the target, that's a 1 in 4 RNG lay, so that's like a 25% chance per burst to kill the target, which suddenly brings it back in line with the meta. Are you following me on this? All right, cool. So hopefully that makes sense. And then that meta will persist until you get like 80% critical strike chance. But it's just important to realize that the meta looks one way when you have low percent crit chance or crit when you have a low percent crit chance, and then it looks a completely different way. It's important to know where the shift is and how to combat it, if that makes any sense. Okay. Right, so very little for a long time. That's definitely to your advantage as a game designer. You can also see that once we make this shift at the 40% critical strike chance mark, then we're comfortable adding critical strike chance onto our burst classes in their gearing for a very, very, very long period of time. Fuck, I forgot one here. I need to write this down. Increasing critical strike chance, this is how it affects the burst meta. But it affects the DPS meta differently, right? So what do I mean by a DPS meta? Well, the DPS meta would be, like, let's say I'm doing nothing but hard casting heals into myself, and the enemy is doing nothing but casting offensive spells into me or DPSing me down. Increasing critical strike chance might not affect the burst meta, but it will affect the DPS meta because it's making it more likely that the DPS class will do more damage on average. And of course, it's important to keep hardcasting healing classes do more HPS than DPSers do DPS. But the classic WoW rules, the classic WoW Jedi curve, that if you adhere to that, you won't have a problem whatsoever, which is why it's not being talked about here right now. Basically, healing spells get slightly more spell power ratio behind them than DPS spells do, and so healing spells will just always do more HPS than the DPS spells. The only time that doesn't happen is when a good RNG lay on the crit chances come through and kill the DPS class, but that's still good game design, so it's like blah, 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 blah. Just know that increasing the critical strike chance will affect the overall DPS, and it will affect DPS meta to an extent. But it doesn't really affect the burst meta, which is very interesting. Okay, number 5. Increasing plus damage always affects top-end burst damage and thus always affects the meta. Right, yeah. So increasing damage by 10% versus increasing damage by critical strike chance by 10%, they don't have the same effects. Increasing critical strike chance just increases the win rate percent chance per burst, or the survivability counterplay chance per burst, right? That's all it's really affecting. But increasing damage on classes will always affect the burst meta, and it always needs to be accompanied with an increase in HP on the classes. So, for example, if I increase damage on the caster classes by 10%, I'm going to need to increase the HP levels on all of the recipients, basically on every class in the game, by somewhere around, I think it's going to be upwards of like 13%. It has to be more because it does have compounding synergized effects with critical strike chance, like obviously, right? But if I go up 10% critical strike chance, I might not need to do a goddamn thing to people's HP bars. All that's happened is their win rate per burst went up, but it didn't go up enough to break the game or to change anything whatsoever. So that's why number 4 is written down here the way it is. So it's a good thing to realize that as game designer, if you're increasing damage on classes, you have to increase HPs in the burst meta. But if you're increasing critical strike chances, there's a lot of leeway to increase critical strike chance without increasing people's HP bars. All right, cool. Let me take a drink of water here. But it will affect the DPS meta, obviously. Oh, and also, I guess if I'm increasing the spellcaster damage by 10%, I also have to increase plus healing by something stupid like HPS by like 15%. Otherwise, that meta would break down. All right, let me pause the video and let me try rewriting this so it takes into account some of the things that I went, oh shit, I need to put that in. Oh shit, I need to put that in. And we'll call this video a video and Deo's fault. Let me pause the video really fast. You know what? On second thought, I've decided I don't care. And if you guys want to write it down yourself, feel free to pause the video and do it. Because I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, man, I wanted one to go right here. Like right here, I needed to write it down, but I can't remember what it was. Like I know what I need to put here, but I can't remember what the hell I needed to put at the end of number 3. Fuck. And I'm just sitting here like, damn. All right, well, I guess I'm just defeated. So I'm just gonna end the video here and Deo's fault. And wish you guys the best of luck. Oh, in Season of Discovery right now, every class that I've been bursted on is decently game designed. Like, everything is fine with the sole exception of the Mage Burst. The Mage Burst has everything in a burst that you do not want to see right now. I made an entire video on it. It's doing everything wrong, basically, and it's a really good example of how to basically do things wrong. While the burst is taking place, so let's just go over it really fast. So while the Mage Burst is taking place, you have no counterplay options whatsoever. You're stunned for 5 seconds, and then you're silenced for 4 seconds afterwards, which means the only thing you can do is like PvP trinket, and then like heal pot, and then like whipper root. But while they're bursting on you, they basically have like a 90% crit chance. Okay, so that's really bad. Their spells do double damage when they crit things. That's also really bad. There's a high percent chance every second that they get extra attacks effectively because they get to instantly cast out their spells. as opposed to hard casting them for 2 seconds. They can instant cast them out at 1.66 seconds. My bad, not. They can instant cast them out at 1.25 seconds, which is a massive increase in DPS if RNG goes their way. So, for example, I had Zaryu kill me in less than 5 seconds. I never came out of the Ice Cube because he got to instant cast out 3 Frost Bolts, one after the other, and I just exploded despite being the tankiest that I can possibly be. The RNG damage on the burst is 8,000 at the low end, when 6,000 damage is more appropriate burst levels. 6,000 damage is one of those things that damage in the game that is lethal, unless you're specifically gearing to counter it, right? And then it only becomes semi-lethal, which is where you want the game, which is perfect game design. 8,000 frost damage is unsurvivable unless you're gearing heavily in frost resist, and even then. But it's the low end damage. It's doing 8,000 damage on the low end, so it's too much damage even on the low end of RNGesus. And on the high end of RNGesus, it's completely and totally unsurvivable. And also has like no counterplay options and yada yada yada. So I'm looking at good game design versus bad game design as far as the burst meta is concerned. Yeah, so I'm just looking at this video here and Deus Vault. Hopefully you guys enjoy my rants, and it is what it is. Later.